Well, hey, friends, welcome back to Rooted Refresh, the place where we spend a few minutes each week getting rooted in God's Word so our souls can be refreshed. I'm glad you're here. Now, last week we were looking at Romans chapter 8 and we were encouraged and strengthened by those powerful truths that Paul shares about no condemnation and God's unstoppable love. Well, this week, as he moves into chapter 9, or as he continues his letter, and we call it chapter 9, we look at a chapter that pushes us to think deeply about God's sovereignty, his mercy, and his faithfulness. So let's dive in together. Paul opens with something very honest, emotional, something really downright amazing for us to think about. He says he has great sorrow, unceasing anguish in his heart for his fellow Israelites. In fact, he loves them so deeply that he would even be willing to be cursed, to be cut off from Christ if it would bring them salvation. That's heavy, but it's also a great definition of sacrificial love. He reminds us then of all the incredible blessings that God gave to Israel. He gave them sonship, the glory, the covenants, the law, the temple worship, the promises, and the patriarchs. Most importantly, he gave them the Messiah himself who came through their line. And yet, many of them rejected Jesus. And so Paul asked the hard question, has God's word failed? Well, his answer is clear, absolutely not. Paul then shares how not everyone who is descended from Israel actually belongs to Israel. God's promise has always worked through his sovereign choice. And Paul gives two examples. Isaac was chosen over Ishmael. And what about Rebekah's twins, Jacob and Esau? God said the older will serve the younger before they were ever born, before they had ever done anything good or bad. Why? Well, so that God's purposes would stand. In other words, not based on works, but based on God's call, God's will. Well, this leads to the big question that many people ask then. Is God unjust? Well, Paul's response comes straight from God. It's a quote from God speaking to Moses. Paul shares it in verse 15. As God says, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Meaning it doesn't depend on human effort, it depends on God's mercy. Then Paul uses the powerful imagery of the potter and the clay, showing us the potter has every right to shape the same lump of clay into different vessels for different purposes. God is sovereign. He can show mercy to some, and he can harden others, all to display his power, all to proclaim his name throughout the earth. Now, the beautiful part is how this all fits into God's bigger plan. He not only called the Jews, but also the Gentiles to be his people. And many in Israel stumbled over Jesus. He became their stumbling block. And it was because they pursued their own righteousness through their works instead of by faith. But the Gentiles who weren't even looking for righteousness received righteousness through faith. So, what does Romans chapter 9 mean for you and I today? Well, it reminds us that God's plans never fail. Our salvation, our calling, our security rests completely in his mercy, in his sovereign love. It's not based on our performance or our pedigree. Now that humbles us because we know none of us deserve God's mercy, but it also comforts us because the same God who chose Jacob calls us. And he is the same God who has raised Jesus from the dead. He is the God who is fully in control. Well, this week I would like to encourage you to take a little time out, if you will, and spend some time reading Romans chapter 9 slowly. Let it leave you in awe of God, who is both perfectly just and incredibly merciful. Rest in the truth that His word has not failed, and His purposes stand firm. If this episode has hopefully in some way encouraged you or refreshed you in some way, would you be so kind as to like, subscribe, maybe even share it with someone who may need that encouragement, that refreshing? Feel free to drop a comment. Tell me which part of Romans 9 stood out to you the most. Hey, thanks for joining me today. And remember, you are deeply loved by God. So stay rooted in Him, refresh your soul in His Word. And good Lord willing, I'll see you next week as we step into Romans chapter 10. God bless you. Have a great week.